Welcome everybody to this first conference, the first Human Factors in Diving conference. I'm really pleased that we've got the people here. We've got some fantastic speakers over the next 2 days. There are lots of tables out there. We were hoping for a little more people, but that's fine. One of the benefits of this LexGo platform is that you can speak to your fellow table members during the presentations. You can compare notes, or if you want to be on your own and listen and take notes as you go along, that's great. But that, one of the reasons why I chose the LexGo Live platform is so that you can actually meet and interact and converse with people as we go along. Because I'm sure there will be some challenging thoughts and presentations as we go through these next 2 days. Just as a sort of an admin side, I thought I was doing something easier by making the timings as 0900 UTC start, and all of the agendas are based in British summertime. So the agenda boards are going to be amended just to remind you that they're British summertime. I'm also going to remind you that you're going to get emails with 3 minutes to go to each of the presentations, so you know where things are or which sessions are coming up. And the room captains are going to also give you an update from that as we present. So the idea now is that I am going to run through my little presentation, which is all about a voyage of discovery and learning. And the idea, everybody should be on a table listening to this. And I'm going to talk about this voyage of discovery and learning. And it's not just, so this is the introduction. This is about how did human factors come into the different industries that I've been involved in, and how did it develop, and where we are now in terms of human factors in diving. So the sort of the layout that we're going to have, and here we go, that's always the laugh. For the voyages, I'm going to talk about some well-known voyages and get people thinking about the voyage and the difference between a voyage and a journey. So I'm going to talk about where human factors developed in terms of aviation, healthcare, oil and gas, and I'm also going to touch on what the US Forest Service have done in terms of their learning opportunities, their learning reviews, and moving from investigations into learning activities. Then my journey, both as a diver and where I've come and brought human factors into diving. And then I'm going to talk about what other opportunities are out there, what other resources that can help people develop their own knowledge, because it's not just me. There are lots of other people out there doing human factors, slightly different facets of it, but it is, a wide area. I'm then going to move on to about the human factors in diving and where that is. And the opportunities that are coming up. And the goal of this first session today is to take us up to now. And then the closing session tomorrow, I'm going to summarize the presentations that we've had, bring out some key points, and then say, look, where does the journey go? Where do we bring more of this human factors, this really important knowledge, and apply it to the diving, not just as individuals, but as training agencies, as dive centers. And that's really why I've brought a huge spread of knowledge and experience in giving people practical tools and techniques that they can use in their own diving. And then we'll talk about your journey through the conference and how things are set up and moving around. So I will start now with a journey or a voyage, you could say, for Magellan, where the first circumnavigation of the world. 2 years it took them to sail. Now, they even made it through the Magellan Straits, which were named after him, in the very southern tip of South America. Now, unfortunately, Magellan didn't make it back, having had a bit of a clash with some natives on the way. Now, of those 5 ships that set off, hang on. Here we go. Let's put the slide on so you can see what's there. Of the 5 ships that went out, only 1 made it back, which I'm hoping that we'll have a high level of continued attendance as we run through this session, and that people won't drop out. I know it's a long day. It's 8 hours for both of the days, but I'm confident that there is so much useful information that you will stay and you will make it all the way through. Next one I'm going to bring up is Shackleton's expedition, and this was really about something. I mean, I love the newspaper advert. Men wanted for hazardous journeys, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. And was inundated with people going, yeah, I'll give this a go. It's a journey of unknowns, and going out there, and their story is just amazing in terms of resilience and getting back, and not even just getting to Elephant Island. Then there was 16 days of sailing in a small whaler boat to get onto South Georgia, and then Shackleton and one of the others climbed the mountains to make it into the whaling station. They were just like surprised about what was going on. In the meanwhile, they'd left a number of their teams on Elephant Island, and then it took them another 128 days to go and 3 different ships to go and rescue those people. So an amazing journey and a voyage that was there. So this again it's difficult trying to bring human factors into diving as a discretionary activity is not easy. Then I'm going to talk about space as a voyage and a continual journeys, or multiple journeys that are going on, from Mercury to Apollo to the space shuttle, and the 2 disasters that fell upon that program, or those programs, of Challenger and Columbia, and the legacy in terms of safety management and the term normalization of deviance that Diane Vaughan coined when looking at launch decision with Challenger. Now, you'd think an organization, when they lost Challenger, would learn, but they didn't, and it took another loss through Columbia before they realized that they had to do something about it. But as a major organization, they were under so many different pressures, commercial pressures, to get the activities done. And now where space is with Virgin Galactic, and last week with in fact earlier this week with Inspiration 4, putting civilian astronauts into space in an activity that, it was all computer controlled. They were up there, they'd had 6 months of training, but in effect, they were along for a ride. They were doing experiments and things, but, they were the first real sort of, I'm going to say, space civilians that are out there. Now, I purposely touched on the space side because I've got a presentation from one of the speakers is all about going from the sea to the stars, and what space has learnt from the underwater realm, and what the underwater realm, the divers, can learn from the space and aviation industry. And another speaker, Beatrice, who's one of my instructors within the Human Diver, is going through the European Space Agency astronaut selection program as well. So it's an amazing opportunity that's out there. And those journeys have had disasters, but they are pushing and going forward and realize that it's worthwhile. Now, I'm going to move on to now, what is human factors? And it's a huge subject. You could summarize it as this phrase of making it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. It's much bigger than that. When we talk about the interactions with people and other people and hardware systems and the social environment and the paperwork and the procedures and the rules, understanding how we interact within the system and the associated well-being that goes with it is what human factors is about. Now, it's what it isn't are these bits here. It's not just factors of the human. And we talk about this thing of, it's the human factor. No, it's much more than that. It's also not another term for human error, where people make mistakes. We end up with pilot error, diver error, oil worker error, whatever. We don't just say, that's the human factors bit. It's much more. And then the final bit is it's not common sense. And this is the difficulty when trying to bring, again, human factors into diving. People go, oh, it's just common sense. We know what we're supposed to do. But it's not. Common sense is attributed nearly always after an adverse event. And therefore we can make it, it's very easy to spot where the errors and mistakes have occurred. But in real time, people do what makes sense to them at the time. Common sense is developed over time through your own experiences. So if you've never encountered that situation before, you're unlikely to have it built in as part of your common sense. So when we look at human factors and the activities that take place, one of the key things is to apply this concept of local rationality. How does it make sense for somebody to do the right thing? And that could be a push-pull door. It could be a handset controller and a rebreather. It could be a buoyancy control device and how that's configured. It could be about how the training manuals are all configured. These are all aspects of human factors. So I'm going to talk now on aviation, which is my background. And this is a photo I took low level around Scotland, up in the mountains near Glencoe. And the idea here is to show you where aviation didn't just magic up human factors. They were on a process, a journey, and a voyage that happened. And we start off with checklists in 1935 with Model 299, which were brought in because this was the most complex aircraft that had been flown at the time. It was also the most capable. And what was a simple mistake of forgetting a rudder gust lock on the aircraft, the flying controls. The pilot forgot that because there was lots of other stuff going on at the time. And of the 5 people on board, 2 people were killed, and that included Major Hill, he was the chief test pilot for the US Army Air Forces. And their immediate response was more training. And it's like, hang on a minute, how much more training can we give? This is probably the best pilot we've got who's out there flying, and he makes a mistake. So they said, well, what was it that he did? And it was like, well, how do we stop people forgetting things? And it was the same thing as having a shopping list. Oh yeah, it's a to-do list. So having an external brain, which is what checklists are really about, is slowing us down, and they reduce the likelihood of an accident from occurring. So checklists were one of the things that happened. Another bit was about physical design, the combing design. 1942, a psychologist noticed, or basically brought in to try and work out why pilots were raising the landing gear instead of the flaps. And on this display, the 2 red boxes show you where gear up and flaps are. And when the guys were coming back from, say, their night bombing raids, they were all really stressed. The aircraft are being shot up, they're tired, everything's, hasn't necessarily gone right. And when they taxi off the runway and the captain says flaps up, they would reach down and flick a switch. And because those switches are almost identical and spatially located close together, the gear would come up instead of the flaps. And they just kept on saying more training, more training. And they brought in a psychologist who went, how's about you just move those switches? And in hindsight, well, that's just common sense. So they moved the switches spatially on the combing, and they put a little wheel on one of them, and they put a little wooden flap on the flap, and they never had the same mistake again. So it's this bit that says we can't fix the human. What we can do is we can change the conditions which people are working in. Having shared mental models and assertion skills, and this is where cockpit and then became crew resource management came about. Where we've got UA-173 ran out of fuel because they were task loaded, trying to solve the problem, and the flight engineer hadn't highlighted that there was an issue. Well, they had, but he wasn't assertive enough, and they ran out of fuel. Top right, Tenerife, 1977, 583 people killed when 2 747s collided on the runway in Tenerife. Technically, nothing wrong with the aircraft, but the mental models that were held by the different crew members, by the other aircraft, Pan Am and KLM, and air traffic control, they were all different. And so they were given, the captain thought he got takeoff clearance. The flight engineer and the co-pilot weren't sure about it, but weren't able to speak up. And as a consequence, they ended up with the largest loss of life that happened. Eastern 401 in the Florida Everglades, trying to fix a broken light bulb for when the landing gear was put down. And they were trying to work out, was it a bulb failure or was it that the landing gear actually wasn't down? And in the process of flying a holding pattern, the autopilot was disengaged at some point, and it started a gradual descent. And that descent was imperceptible to the crew because everybody was task loaded with what's going on. And unfortunately, it crashed with a total loss of life in the Everglades. And then we've got the Kegworth crash in East Midlands, where the pilot shut down the wrong engine and ended up shutting down the working engine and then flying to the crash site with a broken engine, and they couldn't relight the good one in time. And there were 74 people killed and 47 people injured. These were big, I'm going to say, seminal events in the aviation industry that said, you know what, something isn't quite right. We've highly trained these pilots. We've given them, lots of technical skills on how to operate and interact with the aircraft, but we're not giving them the skills to share the mental models, the understanding of what was going on next. What's happening now, what's going to happen next. And when there was a difference in mental models, they didn't have the perception, or they didn't have the skills to speak up because of this thing called cross-cockpit authority gradient. This inability where we have deference to authority, where we won't challenge and we won't speak up. And there are so many similar examples in the diving world. So something that what they also recognized following the Kegworth crash and the Manchester fire landing on fire with, I've forgotten the airline, British Airways. And so what they realized was that this cockpit resource management was not enough because the back-end crew, the cabin crew, were aware that things weren't quite right, and they weren't part of this mental model, this assertion training that was going on. And in fact, on the Kegworth crash, one of the passengers highlighted to the cabin crew that the engine was out on their side, or that there were sparks and coming from that side. But the cabin crew didn't speak to the pilots at the time. So what they did is they then moved it into crew resource management, not taking it further from cockpit resource management. And now anything that goes on in aviation has human factors that touch it, and that's maintenance, it's air traffic control. And in fact, air traffic control are leading the way in a number of human factor studies because of the stresses that are going on. So then we move on to automation, and we're building really complex and clever aircraft to deal with what's going on. And so the problem we have there is a mental model about what we expect to see, and the problem is that our ideas are not the same. Now I'm just pausing because there's some people on the stage that shouldn't be here. You can't see them, I can, and they're just distracting me. So there we go. So that might be a subtle hint to move somewhere else. So what we end up with is developing these computerized systems that people have an understanding, or they think they have an understanding about what's going on. And there were two crashes here that really sort of set the scene for aviation. One was Air France 296, where it was an air display at Paris, and the pilots were unaware of what the autopilot was doing. There's this classic bit of, what's the computer doing now? And the problem with this is that as we interact manually with a system, then we are building up a mental model of stuff comes in, we deal with it, stuff goes out, and we understand what's happening. When we have heavily automated systems, we're in a situation where stuff goes in. Hannah, can you leave the stage, please?
Oh.
So we've got this heavily automated system that we haven't, we don't know what's happening in this black box, and so our idea of this is flawed. And this led us to a problem 2009 when Air France 447, make sure that's right, crashed in the South Atlantic. 2009, 1st June 2009, where the pilots were unaware of what the autopilot system was doing. They were in a deep stall, and they'd been taught that things weren't supposed to happen that way. Their mental model of how the aircraft was going to operate was flawed. Now, this isn't this isn't new stuff. 1983, Lisanne Bainbridge wrote this paper about the ironies of automation, this double-edged sword that says automation's great because it can do stuff for you. The downside is when stuff is done for us, we stop paying attention to it. And I know that Tim Clements is going to talk more about this in his presentation on human factors in rebreather CE certifications, because that's where the major factor about automation comes in the diving industry. But we have technology, dive computers. When we've got a dive computer, we don't necessarily monitor what depth we're doing, how long we're at that sort of depth. And then when the computer fails, we look at it and go, I don't understand that. Or if people don't understand the warning systems that come from that, like they will be stuck at, say, they were holding their stops at, say, 5.5 to 6 meters. If it drops to 6 meters, the decompression clock stops counting down. And I've had a couple of incident reports where people have gone low on gas or run out of gas because they didn't want to get bent, because they had no real idea how long their decompression stop would be. So there is a piece that is an issue there. Pierre, can you leave the stage as well, please? So what they then started to do is understand this concept of threat and error management. So it's not just about building the mental model about what's happening and dealing with the technical and non-technical skills in real time. It was also what's going to happen next. So if you know that you're going to go into a busy airport and the weather is marginal, which way the wind's going to blow, well, maybe set the flight management system up so that you've got your contingency operations already in place. So if air traffic control all of a sudden say, take the opposite runway or the cross runway, you've already got those procedures in place. So what they're looking at is, how would we make errors? How would they be manifested? And what can we do to build those up, or to put contingencies in place? So it's about being proactive in terms of the risk management that's happening. Now, those activities, yes, there were lots of accidents. And if you look at the data that shows how things developed over time, the sort of 60s and 70s and early 80s, it wasn't a great place to be flying civilian aircraft. And they realized that they had to do something, but it was only because they could start to investigate the activities and the actions that were going on, and start looking at cockpit voice recorders, flight data recorders, and then getting people to create the culture so that people could report systems in place. So we've got the National Transportation Safety Board, who will look at accidents, and not just aviation, but rail and maritime as well, and automobile work. So it's a huge organization that will try and capture the events that are occurring and then produce reports that go out. Now, the role of the NTSB is about understanding what's going on, not about attributing blame. The downside is then people take those, I'm going to say, neutral reports and then put them into legal activities, litigation activities, and then use the learning, the safety information against those who've basically provided it. And I'm going to say it's not fair, because what that does is it limits the learning that's going on. In the UK, I'm going to say probably about 6 or 7 years ago, there were 2 cases that challenged how the Air Accident Investigation Branch dealt with their reports. One was for a helicopter crash up in Glasgow, police helicopter. Another one was a Hawker Hunter at the Brighton Air Show. And the families who were involved wanted to get the evidence from the investigation, so any data that's there, because they wanted it to be part of a legal case to go back against the people involved. And the AAIB said, no, that is confidential safety information, and we are not going to be presenting that. Matthias, can you get off the stage as well, please?
Okay.
Go to another room. There we go. This is all learning. It's the first time we've done this and used this platform. So going back to the AIB. So the AIB said, no, you are not going to have that information because it will compromise the learning that happens. And the point there is that we need to have context-rich information from those involved. And so the aviation safety reporting system's put up as a confidential reporting system whereby people can submit, and there is a benefit to reporting here, and I think it's 7 days. If you've had a near miss or an accident or something that's a learning opportunity, it might be a violation, we've gone through controlled airspace. If you report that within 7 days, then you won't have any punitive action paid against you. And the goal here is to collect the learning. So that's a voluntary system, ASARS, and another voluntary system is CHIRP, which runs in the UK, and that covers aviation, maritime. It's also started to involve drones for the reporting there, because there's a huge amount of learning to go on. Now, all of these are confidential systems. They're not anonymous systems. And I know that Frauke is going to talk about this in her presentation this afternoon, talking about diver incident report systems and the challenges in terms of putting those together. So health, aviation working hard, and it's still got way to go, because it's not just the tools and the systems, but healthcare has picked up a number of these lessons learned that have come from aviation. So we start off with the anaesthetist's non-technical skills handbook, and that started in 1999 with some work with Rona Flynn, and it got a grant to look at how do anaesthetists make sense of the world that they're doing, and how do they interact with the people in the operating theatre. So they led the way in terms of developing these things called behavioral marker schemes. And the idea here is that you as an observer or a trainer or a peer can basically run through a table of things that basically, what does situation awareness look like? Or what does teamwork look like? What does communication look like? And these were used as part of live operations, but as simulation tools and capabilities developed in healthcare, then they can also be used in the training environment. And now you can start creating really stressful environments whereby you are pushing the boundaries of these non-technical skills. And anybody who's done some training with me, face-to-face training, it's exactly the same sort of thing. And then we moved on to the non-technical skills for surgeons, the NOTS, and this was done at the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. And they produced a training program, a handbook, that was in 2011. And this, a lot of the NOTS stuff is available. The ANTS work is available, open source. It's what the organizations do with it to make it effective in terms of the healthcare professionals. And then in 2017, following a number of, I'm going to say, high profile cases and the recognition that internal investigations within hospitals or trusts were not independent, that they were missing things because they were in effect marking their own homework. They didn't want to highlight that there were issues at the systemic, at the organizational level. And that is something that aviation has learned, that it's not just the pilot who's flying the aircraft. That pilot's activities and execution of skills are based on the system in which they sit. And so having some form of independence when it comes to safety investigations is critical. And we don't have that in the diving industry. And I'll talk more about that tomorrow afternoon. So the healthcare safety investigation branch, they look at themed activities. They'll look at an event or a number of events that are linked, and then they'll try and extrapolate that learning to go out to the wider healthcare community. And it's a fantastic model. It's taken a long time. It's taken some harrowing investigations or events to bring it to the fore. And one of those was the inspiration for the work that I'd done in human factors with somebody called Martin Bromley, in which he made a documentary called Just a Routine Operation, and that was the motivation for If Only. If we go look at oil and gas, when I left the Air Force in February 2015, my first job outside was delivering human factors training in the oil and gas sector. And the person I was working with, Phil Smith from Critical Team Performance, was involved in drafting a number of these document sets. And what we did was we delivered a couple of days of training in a classroom, and then we would go spend time on a rig coaching. Now, these documents started in around 2014, and the idea was, what is crew resource management for well operations? Okay, then how do you go about putting it in place? And then once you've got it in place, how do you show that you're actually making an improvement? And it's difficult. It's difficult to show these non-tangible things that are out there. But the surface side of the oil industry has got this, and they recognize that there is a significant benefit to bringing these skills in place. Now I'm going to touch on the Wildfire side, is how they moved on, and specifically this concept called a learning review guide, which a colleague of mine in the States, Ivan Papilidi, headed the development of this process. And so prior to the learning review, they used to have something called the Serious Accident Investigation Board. And this was very much old school safety, old school investigations. And it was looking for errors, deviations, violations. And it was very much about the individuals not doing what they were supposed to do, because the language in the learning review was all about looking for human error. Whereas actually when Ivan put this program together, and it wasn't just about the firefighters on the ground, it was also the air crew who were operating the lead planes and the water bombing planes as well. They were losing a lot of people. So they changed the language in this learning review to be more curious, more about learning, all about understanding the local context. What were the influences that led to people's decisions? And every year, the Wildfire Lessons Learned Center produces a report. Now, they have a live website that puts stuff out there. They also put this annual report. Now, it's not just a report. So I know that the British Aqua Club put an annual report out. Divers Alert Network put annual reports out. These are great. They're great tools. What was more important when it came to this stuff was you had buy-in from the stakeholders who recognized they were fallible and they could learn and develop accordingly. And so it's getting the stakeholder buy-in, both to submit learning stuff, but also to consume the data with specific learning products so that then they could get better. So in terms of my dive, so that's the sort of the background of human factors in other industries. I'm now going to move into the diving piece. My diving journey started in 1999, where I learned to dive in Greece in Lefkas. And I was introduced to deviations straight away, because when I did my final dive, I went to fill in my logbook, and the instructor, and we'd gone to 24 meters because that's where the fish were. There was nothing at the 18-meter bit. I didn't know anything. So I went to fill the logbook in, and I was going to write down 24 meters. And the instructor said, no, you can't write that down. You've got to write 18 because we're not allowed to go deeper than 18 meters on our course. I was like, okay, fine. You're the instructor. I'll write that down. A number of years later, I go out to dive the Wreck Alley in San Diego. I'm still open water diver at this stage. I've got about 8 or 9 dives to my name. And on the Saturday, I went with a guide, and we stayed at 18 meters maximum depth. And then we went out on the Sunday on an advanced open water dive. Now, I'd signed additional waiver forms to let me go out on this 30-meter dive. I jumped off the back of the boat, had some issues. And one of the major ones was that the low pressure inflator hose had disconnected from my BC inflate. And so I had no buoyancy. I was wearing a wetsuit. Now, I knew the bottom was about 30 meters, so I wasn't too worried. And then we struggled a bit on the bottom to get it reconnected. And I then got back into diving in the UK, and I realized that I didn't know what I didn't know. And at that similar time, I was going through, and I'll cover that on the next slide, going through my professional development in terms of aircrew and doing a master's degree in aerospace systems. And I started to look at how does diving manage safety and incident reporting and all of the stuff that makes aviation safe. And so over my diving career, I've basically got up to the stage now as a normoxic trimix CCR diver and open circuit hypoxic trimix. Nearly all of my training has been done through GUE. Now, in terms of the flying, I spent nearly all my time flying on Hercules. That was all my flying stuff. I got about 2,500 hours, deployed multiple places, operations. I then became a flight instructor for my last 2 years before going off to be a student on the Aerosystems course. From the Aerosystems course, I went into flight trials. I went into research and development, so acting with some very bright scientists and converting that into frontline speak or strategic speak, working on lots of those. And then the last 5 years was in procurement and systems engineering, writing requirements to put protective systems on aircraft, stop them getting shot down. And then I left in February 2015 after 25 years in. So I've got a very broad view of systems engineering. And at about a similar time, so about 2010, I was getting quite interested in writing about safety and human factors in diving and trying to change attitudes to improve more of a just culture that's there. And what we had at this stage was I'd gone through some research and I wrote a white paper. Now I put my hand up here. That was written with quite an immature, directive tone. And I presented it to a group in the UK, and I upset a number of people. And I'm sorry for that. I was very directive in how stuff was being done and how it could be improved. That tone has changed. And shortly after that paper was written, I then started a part-time PhD at Cranfield University. And I stopped that after 6 years because it wasn't going anywhere. I was getting demotivated. I couldn't get the data I needed. And I was starting to teach diving, human factors in diving, and that was getting my motivation. And at the same sort of time, I was working in the offshore industry, as I sort of said. That, again, trying to create change in an industry that manages risk all the time and trying to say, look, there are potentially more effective or more efficient ways of doing something without coming across and saying what you're doing is wrong. And there had to be a level of self-discovery about what's going on. Now, that academic side may continue. I've got some irons in the fire about looking. It won't be at Cranfield, it'll be somewhere else. But the goal of putting something like a learning review for the diving industry. Now, in January 2016, I formed the Human Diver, or a predecessor of the same company, but the goal was to educate, provide some training. And the first couple of pilot classes I ran, people went, this is fantastic. We've got to, this should be in the training materials. Have no idea how you're going to market this because safety doesn't sell. Safety is a dynamic non-event. By that, I mean, when things are safe, you don't know about it. Because we're managing things. Now that can lull us into a false sense of security that says, well, nothing's gone wrong, therefore we must be okay. So about 4 years of doing face-to-face training, started to move into the online area. And somebody said, well, why don't you write a book? So I did. It took me about 6 months to write. I had lots of stories that brought it together. And that's what Under Pressure is about, which has sold more than 4,000 copies now. And I have instructors who use it as their training materials, and the same thing for the online training programs for the Human Diver. And then one of the things I sort of touched on just a routine operation earlier is the motivation for producing If Only, which was a documentary about Brian Buggy's fatality in 2018. And the work there was incredibly powerful. It was incredibly meaningful. And Ashley, the widow, is going to talk tomorrow about the power of storytelling. And what I did, we flew out to Hawaii, JP Bresser, who was the film guy, and myself, and we did face-to-camera interviews with Ashley and the dive team. We got an understanding about what happened, and we told a story. And you can get that from the Human Diver website. And there is if you're an instructor or you want to learn more, there is a guide or workbook that allows you to dig into that in more detail. And my goal is, and I know some instructors already do, they play If Only as part of their rebreather training classes and say, watch this and follow the sequence that's set in the workbook to get people thinking about accidents and not just a single event. They are a complex emergence or an emergence from complex factors coming together. It's too easy just to say decompression sickness or a rapid ascent or running out of gas. We have to look deeper into the context. And as I say, Frauke will talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. There are other bits in terms of what's going on in the diving. This was one of the original pieces that was out there, December 96, and Human Factors in Diving. And this really focused on the factors of the human. Then we moved into 2011, 2012. 2011, if you're involved in any rebreather work, get hold of Research Report 871. And if you're in a training agency, this highlights the human factors issues of running rebreathers in normal and contingency or emergency procedures. There is a wealth of information that's in there. The rebreather 403, which happened in May 2012, brought a whole bunch of people, rebreather specialists, together to show that we can improve the safety of rebreather diving that's going on. Now, in terms of other individuals, I'm going to say there's Laura Walton, who's going to be talking at the conference, talking about panic tomorrow. So she used to have a site called Scuba Psych. It's now called Fit to Dive. And I've seen her pop in the stage just earlier, so I know she's in the room. And there's also Matt Jevons, who runs he runs a dive center in Ireland, but he's a psychologist, high performance coach, and he runs a Facebook group called Psychological Skills for Diving. And so they're resources that are well worth looking at. And I'll talk about tomorrow which of the agencies are starting to put materials into their training programs in a more concerted effort. So that wraps up my opening presentation. And just now to say about your journey, this conference, I've purposely chosen a breadth of speakers. The next one in Hall 1, Diane Chadwick-Jones, she is going to be talking about bringing a safety culture into the diving industry and bringing safety culture into revised safety culture in BP because of the role that she had. And key to that was rewriting the way that a just culture was put together. We're going from club level with Matthias Smith, who's coming in from Melbourne. We've got technical divers, we've got people from the National Park Service, we've got trainee astronaut who's coming in from Melbourne. Lots and lots of things and practical tips from people who are out there, instructors who have built human factors into their training programs, or dive center owners who've put this into their safety management system for their dive center. Now, the next time I'm going to be on will be tomorrow afternoon. I'm going to talk about the messy world of diving, and that's going to be in Hall 1. And the next time you come into hall this big, the main thing is tomorrow afternoon at 1600 UTC or 5 o'clock UK time, or wherever you're going to be. So what I'd ask you to do now, you've got 17 minutes to basically grab some refreshments, go to toilet break, go and meet some of the people that are in the conference. You can go into the lobby. There's some lounges there that you can go and have a chat, or you can just jump on each other's tables and have a chat there. But the presentation will kick off on the top of the hour for Hall 1 and Hall 2. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions or feedback, just if you see me bopping around the conference, jump in the same table that I'm at and we can have a conversation. But in the meantime, thank you very much and enjoy yourselves.